Welcome to I Believe, where we talk about governance and philosophy in America. I'm Joel Douglas, and I believe in America. Thanks for joining me.
Petro Kalnyshevsky, the last Cossack. Curtain up, the stage is set. A warrior, a nation, and a betrayal that would echo for centuries. Imagine a man who has spent a lifetime fighting for his people, riding into battle, outmaneuvering empires, defending his homeland. He commands warriors, negotiates with kings, and builds a thriving nation from the wild steppe. And then, at 85 years old, after everything he's given, his so-called ally betrays him. One moment, he was the leader of the fiercest, freest people in Eastern Europe. The next, a prisoner dragged away in chains, locked in a stone cell, left to rot in the cold, endless dark. This is the story of Peter Ivanovich Kalnyshevsky, the last leader of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, betrayed by the Russians. He lived through the rise and fall of a nation and spent 25 years in confinement, refusing to break.
A warrior's rise. Kalnyshevsky was born in the late 1600s in what is now central Ukraine, a land of vast, untamed wilderness where survival meant strength. From a young age, he was drawn to the life of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, the wild horsemen of the steppe. They answered to no king or emperor. They lived by the sword, fought as free men, and bent the knee to no one. By the time Kalnyshevsky rose through the ranks, people both feared and admired the Cossacks. They were known for their brutal raids against the Ottomans and their cunning ability to play empires against each other. But by the mid-18th century, the world was changing. The Russian Empire was expanding, and the Cossacks were caught in a dangerous game. Kalnyshevsky was a master of strategy, on and off the battlefield. In 1762, the people elected him Kosh Ataman, the leader of the Cossacks. Russian Empress Catherine removed him in 1763, but the people, undeterred, elected him against her wishes again in 1765. He ruled with a mix of toughness and diplomacy. Under his command, the Sikh thrived. The Cossacks became essential allies to Russia in its wars against the Ottomans, and Kalnyshevsky hoped that by proving their loyalty, he could secure their independence. Catherine had other plans.
The night of betrayal. The Cossacks failed to shape the battlefield in their favor. They relied on Russian alliances that betrayed them. They believed their contributions would secure their future. By 1774, Russian Empress Catherine the Great had secured a major victory against the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War. That same year, she signed the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, which gave Russia control over Crimea and expanded her empire's reach. The Cossacks, once useful in the fight against the Ottomans, were now a liability. For years, Catherine had been dismantling Ukrainian autonomy. She had already crushed the Hetmanate, another independent Cossack structure, in the 1760s. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were next. She saw them as too independent, too unpredictable. Their lands were valuable, their fighting spirit too dangerous to be left unchecked. The empire could not allow a warrior state to exist within its borders. On the night of June 4th to 5th, 1775, without warning, General Pyotr Tekeli's army surrounded the Zaporozhian Sich, 60,000 Russian soldiers against a few thousand Cossacks. There was no chance. Kalnyshevsky, then 85 years old, knew that fighting would mean slaughter, so he ordered his men to lay down their arms, hoping to negotiate, hoping to save what little remained. He was wrong. Catherine's betrayal wasn't just political. It was complete. That night, there was no bloodshed, but 2 months later, Russia finished the betrayal. On August 3, 1775, Catherine ordered the Sich to be destroyed and wiped off the map. The Russians tore down fortifications, looted homes, and desecrated churches. They seized Cossack records in an attempt to erase their history. Some Cossacks managed to escape to Ottoman-controlled lands. Others were forcibly conscripted into the Russian army. The Zaporozhian way of life, centuries old, was erased. And as for Kalniszewski, the empire couldn't risk letting a legend roam free.
10 Years of Darkness. In July of 1776, the American Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence from Britain. The same month, the Russians arrested and exiled Kalniszewski, and not just any prison. Solovetsky Monastery, a frozen fortress in the White Sea, where political prisoners were sent to vanish. Then, in 1792, the Russians put him in solitary confinement for 10 years. His cell was 3 meters by 3 meters, a stone box with no windows, no books, and no human contact. Kalniszewski sat in the darkness. He went blind. The world outside changed, but he remained trapped, a relic of a lost nation. He was a warrior who had led thousands into battle, now left alone with nothing but his thoughts and prayers. And yet, he refused to break. The Russian Empire expected him to die quickly, but the old Cossack endured. Years of isolation and deprivation robbed him of his vision, but not his will. Even the monastery guards, hardened men who had seen many prisoners die in despair, came to admire him. He became known not as a broken old man, but as a saint-like figure, silent, unshaken, and still carrying the pride of the Cossacks. In 1801, at the age of 110, Emperor Alexander I of Russia pardoned him. Alexander intended to present himself as a reformer. One of his early acts was to grant amnesty to several long-imprisoned political figures. But it was too late. There was nowhere left to go. The Sich was gone. The Cossacks had been scattered. Kalniszewski was an elderly blind man without a home, without a people. So he stayed at the monastery, living out his final 2 years in quiet solitude. When he died in 1803, he was buried in the cold northern soil, far from the land he had fought for.
The last Cossack. Today, we remember Petro Kalniszewski as a symbol of resistance. He refused to break in the face of an empire. Despite efforts in the 1990s to repatriate them, his remains were never relocated to Ukraine. His gravestone exists, but the exact location of his grave is lost, buried at Solovetsky Monastery in Russia. In 2008, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kyiv Patriarchate canonized him as a saint, recognizing his enduring legacy. Today, the last Cossack still stands, a legend of defiance, a reminder that free people will always fight against Russian aggression. Curtain down.
Scene 2. Enter stage right, the capitalists. It so happens that funding the fight of a free people against their Russian oppressors isn't inexpensive. Some Americans think these resources should be a two-way street. If Ukraine wants American support, it needs to prioritize aligning its economic future with U.S. interests. And that starts with a minerals deal. Some say our relationship shouldn't be transactional, but Friday's meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky made it clear that the White House isn't treating support for Ukraine as a matter of ideological solidarity. The United States is making decisions based on interests. If Ukraine wants continued support, securing the mineral rights deal with American companies must be its top priority. Ukraine has a stronger hand than is apparent. America is desperate to counterbalance China's monopoly in the rare earth element business, and getting rare earth elements from Greenland appears increasingly unlikely. From Ukraine's perspective, this agreement is about survival. A stable Ukraine isn't possible without economic security, but economic security depends on stability first. The U.S. won't invest in a war zone. To establish this stability, the minerals deal must include security guarantees, infrastructure commitments, and long-term stability. War is diplomacy combined with other means. Wars aren't won only with kinetic weapons. We achieve national objectives with power, with influence, and with the right pressure in the right places. Money and resources are influence. If Ukraine wants American support, it must commit to an economic relationship that makes its survival an American interest. The minerals deal isn't a side negotiation. It is the negotiation.
Enter stage left, the bleeding heart liberals. It may seem unlikely that those who champion the struggle of the Ukrainian people would need to root for the capitalists, but here we are. We may lament the state of the world, but that doesn't mean we can change it. This is not a new phenomenon. The term bleeding heart liberal first appeared in 1938, mocking those pushing for an anti-lynching bill. The bill failed. Lynchings continued. The U.S. didn't officially make lynching a federal hate crime until 2022, 84 years later. History reminds us that moral clarity doesn't guarantee action. Righteous causes are every day delayed, diluted, or outright denied. And when they are, people suffer. Ukraine can't afford to wait 84 years for the world to catch up. Despite its lack of grace and decorum, the term never quite disappeared. Last week, Elon Musk took aim on X, commenting, quote, "Every bleeding heart liberal I talk to about the Russia-Ukraine war wants to keep feeding bodies into the meat grinder forever. They have no plan for success." End quote. It's easy to mock those who care, but caring without strategy prolongs suffering. If Ukraine is to win, security can't be a moral stance. It must be a vital American interest, which means money, power, and leverage. No one wants more bodies in the meat grinder. Passive support in the form of moral backing, speeches, and aid packages that sustain but don't resolve the conflict isn't enough. We need decisive action. That means changing the conditions of the war in a way that forces Russia to back down, not just keeping Ukraine in the fight. We need to turn Ukraine's security into a U.S. interest through the minerals deal and economic integration. Moral conviction won't stop Russian aggression.
Enter center stage, the pragmatists. The capitalists see opportunity, the bleeding hearts see morality, and the pragmatists see reality. They see that security, economics, and influence are all tied together. If we are to achieve a successful outcome, we have to stop reacting and start shaping the battlefield. Russia is not a friend to the American people. It sponsors violent extremism across Africa and the Middle East, fueling the same instability that leads to deadly attacks on American soil, including the worst in our history, 24 years ago. This threat goes beyond terror networks. Russia actively undermines U.S. alliances and disrupts international stability, making the world more dangerous and unpredictable. The stronger Russia's grip on Ukraine, the more emboldened it becomes elsewhere. Russia has no real incentive to negotiate in good faith because it believes it can outlast Ukraine and Western support. They assume political divisions, shifting U.S. priorities, and battlefield attrition will eventually work in their favor. They will drag out the conflict, knowing that American attention is fleeting. They will use the battlefield as their primary negotiating tool, showing little regard for the lives of their own soldiers, let alone Ukraine's. Instead of waiting for Russia to decide when it's willing to talk, The US and our allies need to shape the conditions under which Russia has no good choices. NATO needs to apply pressure to key pieces of vulnerable Russian geography, such as Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a tiny piece of Russia, separated from the main Russian landmass. Even stopping and searching shipping vehicles entering or leaving Kaliningrad sends a message. No blockade, but disruption. It's not an act of war, but it brings traffic to a standstill. And that means we can blockade Kaliningrad whenever we want. Stopping and searching traffic in and out of Kaliningrad is a message, a warning shot without an empty casing. If Russia escalates or drags their feet in Ukraine, NATO can escalate in Kaliningrad. Russia knows this. Kaliningrad on the table changes the calculus for Russia. Every second they delay in Ukraine, we can squeeze them in Kaliningrad. We need to strengthen our negotiating position. We can't just ask Russia nicely. Strength is the only thing Putin understands. But leverage isn't just about more weapons or more aid. It's about shaping the conditions of the war. We need to make the cost of Russia staying in Ukraine higher than the cost of leaving. And that starts with Kaliningrad. Russia is a threat to the American people, and we need leverage to negate that threat.
In sum, Kalniszewski fought well. He resisted, he endured, but he lost. Not because he wasn't strong enough, not because the Cossacks lacked courage. They failed to shape the battlefield in their favor and were betrayed by their Russian allies. Ukraine cannot afford to make the same mistake. The American capitalists need Ukraine, and Ukraine needs the capitalists. The world doesn't operate on sentimentality. Ukraine must commit to an economic future tied to American interests. Securing a rare earth minerals deal is its survival strategy. The minerals deal isn't a side negotiation, it is the negotiation. The compassionate need Ukraine, and Ukraine needs the compassionate. A tragic reality is that history is full of righteous causes that fail. Support for Ukraine must be more than a moral conviction. It must be a vital U.S. interest. The pragmatists need Ukraine, and Ukraine needs the pragmatists. We need to shape the battlefield. Russia threatens the American people, and we need leverage. Kaliningrad is that leverage. Free people will always resist Russian aggression. Will America stand with them? May God bless the United States of America.